Everyone's favorite ball python is a little bit harder to get in the UK. We discussed the value of empiricism, and I respond to some of your comments. You're watching Amazing Animal Adventures, and today we're talking about the spider ball python. Several months ago I released a video discussing my thoughts and opinions on the spider ball python and why I don't think we should continue breeding or buying this morph of ball python. If you did not see that video, I strongly recommend you go check that out. It lays out the groundwork for some of the stuff I discussed in this video, outlines my basic arguments, and lots of my basic trains of thought. In that video we talked about Sven here. He is a spinner blast ball python. That means he has spider, pastel, and pinstripe all within him, and of course can exhibit that distinctive head wobble. So you may have heard that the UK has banned spider ball pythons. That is one of the inspiring factors for me to make this video. Now we'll get to all the details on what exactly this quote-unquote ban is and how it works. First off, it was enacted in 2018, so it's been around for a good while. I'm not exactly sure how long. However, it's recently become quite a hot topic because a certain individual became very upset and dropped a little rant about it on his channel.
I certainly don't want to be a Debbie Downer.
So contrary to popular belief, this is not a nationwide ban in the United Kingdom. It's something like that. I don't think it's even related to the law. The ban is actually something that is promoted by the IHS, or the International Herp Society, which is based in UK, and basically they sponsor a lot of the expo or reptile shows in the United Kingdom, possibly all of them, and they have, because they have an influence in those shows, they have banned the sale of the spider ball python from those shows. It's still available for like individual and private sale in the United Kingdom. It's just not allowed at any of the shows that are sponsored by the IHS. Not even a real ban, not in the sense, you know, that the parliament or whatever it is that makes up the UK's governmental system, I don't really know, came together and said, we don't want to do spider ball pythons anymore. It's a private organization, a private entity, company, non-profit, I'm not sure what the IHS is, but a private organization saying, we have an opinion about this, we're going to put that into play in these places that we have influence. Pretty much just their reptile shows. So even if I did disagree with the sentiment behind liking spider ball pythons, I would still have no issue with them doing that because, you know, that's their prerogative. I might be upset, but I'm not gonna take an issue with it as I would, you know, take an issue with it if it was a law. However, as you all know, I'm not a proponent for the spider gene. I think it's pretty horrible, and I don't think we should really be breeding them anymore. So I have no issues with the International Herp Society doing whatever they want. It's their prerogative, and I think it's one that's grounded in what I believe to be the right decision, so I'm all for it. This does beg the question though, should we even be banning certain animals? Obviously there's certain bans and restrictions on threatened and endangered animals or dangerous exotic animals in much of the US already, which honestly most of those I think are totally warranted in just about any case. When you're talking about selective gene bans though, that's a whole nother conversation, and I will be the first to admit it is a tough call. It's a slippery slope. As much as I'm against spider ball pythons, I also understand that there is a bit of freedom that should be allowed within certain people's keeping habits. Obviously there's a baseline where, you know, we draw the line, okay, this is okay and this is not okay. I personally think that that should fall relatively low in the standards of, you know, what sort of care and situations are okay for animals and what are not. Beyond that, you might think a lot of things are better and the way it needs to be, but other people might not, and there's some certain things that I don't want you telling me how to do, if that makes sense. All I'm saying is I'm a proponent for individualism within the reptile keeping community. I don't think we all need to be exactly the same. I think different keepers should have some prerogative to keep what they want. However, I'd argue that that's a little bit different than genes, especially a gene that affects the behavior of an animal so severely as is often seen in spider ball pythons. Sven's not doing too bad right now, although you can see a bit of head wobble, but I showed you some of his odd behavior in the previous video, and there are spiders out there that are exponentially worse than him. It's really pathetic. One argument I'm hearing a lot at this time is we should let the community be able to police themselves. The community as a whole will decide, you know, what's right and what isn't, and that will begin to root out lots of problems. And yeah, I understand the logic here, and I think it does root out problems sometimes. I think sometimes that system works, but I also don't think it always works, because it's this one amazing thing called miseducation. So many people are not educated about spiders. I would say the majority of people who go out and buy spiders are not people who have researched them learned about this wobble, and then decided it was okay. I would argue the majority of people who go out and buy spiders are people who don't really know. They're just at a reptile expo and they see a cool looking morph, or they've been in reptiles for a long time and they were just never really informed on the interesting things that will come with genes. I'll get emails or comments or all kinds of stuff about somebody will say like, oh, like I got a bumblebee ball python and it has a wobble. Do you think maybe I got played and it's actually a spider? And, you know, I need to explain, well, no, bumblebee actually includes spider, so yeah, you did get a spider when you bought the bumblebee. That's just an example of how people aren't always informed of, you know, A, what the spider gene does, and B, where the spider gene is found. It's found in so many different combos. Coming back to the question of should we be actually banning stuff like this, it's a tough call, but I would say in this case, I would not necessarily be against it. I'm not necessarily expecting it to happen or predicting that it'll happen. I think there's a long way we need to go before this actually becomes in legislation of the US, let alone the UK, but I would not necessarily be opposed to it. I'll say that much. Moving on to the second part of the video, one of the criticisms I received after my last video was that I didn't necessarily cite any sources. And while I wouldn't say it's true that I didn't cite any sources, because I gave some evidence, you know, of the behavior seen in my, you know, individual animal, in the way it was acting and the way it was responding to different situations and just the general wobble that can be exhibited. So I'm guessing the real concern was that they were not satisfied with just anecdotal evidence, which if you're not familiar with that term, anecdotal evidence is usually something that's just a story. It could be a case study, you know, we're just examining this animal or just one or two animals. It could be an experience that you had. Experiential evidence is often considered anecdotal evidence. It's not necessarily always reflective of the total population or the total spectrum that we're looking at. It might just be, you know, really reflective of just a specific area because of the nature of how that experience took place. I have two thoughts on this. A, it's a fair criticism, and B, I've not seen any empirical evidence from spider people. I haven't seen any, you know, published peer-reviewed papers on why spiders are unaffected or don't care about their condition. But you know, I have seen one or two of these bad boys. How about that? That's a peer-reviewed scientific journal. So this would be considered empirical evidence. It was set up by researchers. Empirical evidence is basically evidence that is obtained when following the scientific method. So that would be observation, question, hypothesis, experiment, results, analyzation, or conclusion. Of course, this depends on the quality of your experiment. Your experiment needs to be good, it needs to be able to be repeatable, it needs to be a quality experiment. That's where peer-reviewed, if you've ever heard that term, comes in. So when we look at a peer-reviewed journal, that's usually something that's been looked at by other researchers that look at it and say, okay, you know what, other researchers, ideally with different biases, and will say, okay, you know what, this could be repeated. This experiment seems fair. It seems like they use a sample size that was, you know, reflective of the total population there. I think this is a valid chunk of evidence. So this paper is peer-reviewed, as I stated already. Other researchers would have looked at this and deemed this paper to be an acceptable form of research of evidence. There are other papers out there regarding spider ball pythons, but this one's one of my favorites, just because of how it's set up and how it works. I strongly recommend you go read it yourself. The link to it is down in the description. But basically what they did is they surveyed several breeders who were breeding spider ball pythons, or at least worked with them in some capacity, and had them write down what the symptoms of the spider wobble was. So ideally these breeders obviously are going to be proponents of the spider gene, so they're not going to be biased and write down symptoms that, you know, aren't there. Like I'm a biased person. I'm already strongly against the spider ball python. If you ask me to write down Sven's symptoms, you know, there's going to be some bias, some unintentional, unconscious bias that goes in to how I'm writing up that symptom list. But if you're proponents for spiders, ideally, hopefully all that bias is going to be out the window. So after they had this list of symptoms, they had the breeders rate the quality of life that they thought the animals had. Most breeders said, yeah, I think our animal has fine quality of life. Then they took the same set of symptoms. Remember, this is symptoms were written by people who were proponents of the spider gene. Took that set of symptoms and gave it to welfare specialists and had them read the list of symptoms and then rate the quality of life. They all rated considerably lower than the breeders. So because they took, you know, the negative information from people that were supportive of the genes and gave it to other people, hopefully that's taking out a bias. It's not just having welfare specialists come in and, you know, making biased comments and remarks of all these different animals and their conditions that they're seeing. This is taking it straight from the source and then translating that with a welfare specialist. So I just thought that's kind of funny that it kind of worked out that way. Anyways, I do strongly recommend you go check it out. Please, 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 links in the description. Educate yourself. So the initial video I released, it's currently my most viewed video out there, and it has upwards of 800 comments. It has a ton of comments. I obviously did not have a chance to respond to all of those, although I think I read the majority of them. So I have an idea of what most people's responses were and what lots of the counter arguments that I got from people were to that video. So I'm going to go ahead and answer some of the major ones that I got over and over again, and ones that I thought were interesting. My spider barely has a wobble at all, or my spider doesn't have a wobble, was one I got a lot. Looking at Sven, you might not initially say he has that much of a wobble because his is really not that bad, but he does have a little bit of one. You can even see it right now. A normal ball python would not be wobbling that much, just even hanging like that. So he does have a little bit of wobble, but it's not nearly as severe as some other ones. How do you explain that? Well, it's all in the genetics. So to explain why, you know, we'll see differing rates of severity, I'm gonna use Sheila right here. Sheila is a pastel ball python. She is a very pretty pastel ball python. Look at those yellows. She is very, very bright. Not all pastels are like this. There are some pastels that are much duller, tanny, orangey. Then there's some that are even brighter and a lot prettier than her. So there's a range of pastels, but it's all the same gene. It's still just the one pastel gene, even though we see that range. And the reason that is because there's other genes that account for an animal's coat. There's a gene for a pattern, for the darkness. I don't know what all the genes are, but there's all these different genes that make up the coat. And the one that controls the pastel colors is, you know, just one location. It's one place on the chromosome. The one that would control the spider gene is a different place, evidently, because we can put spiders with pastels and make bumblebees. So there's all these different genes that make up a coat, and depending on what those other genes are and how the pastel reacts with it, will kind of change how the pastel is expressed on minor levels. Following that same logic, looking at the spider gene, the severity of that wobble is going to be also determined by the other genes that are going to make up all the other quote-unquote neurological things that we find in a ball python. It's not just one gene that controls all of your neurological function. No, there's going to be so many genes that account for that, and the spider wobble is just one of those, and how it interacts with those other genes is going to vary. Another argument I get, this is kind of related here, is we don't need to not breed them at all. We can just breed them for less and less and less. And there's two issues with that. The first is, you know, as I said, we don't really know what's going on inside the head of the animal. And the second issue is that, well, in the words of somebody who is a big proponent of the spider gene and does not wish them to be banned in any way, shape, or form.
Now, it is linked to the gene, so there's no way you're going to separate it.
There you have it. We're never going to get them disconnected. Ultimately, that is because the gene for the head wobble, while it is a separate gene from the gene for the patterning, it's a linked gene, which means that it exists on the same chromosome as the one that codes for the patterning color. If you ever took a biology class of any type, you probably learned about meiosis, which is the production of gametes, which are basically the two cells that will form together to form the very beginning of the organism at fertilization. And to make these gametes, the chromosomes of an organism will be mixed up and shuffled around and all these crazy things. That way the child is a random mix of both the mother and the father's chromosomes. However, what's in each chromosome stays relatively the same. So one of Sven's parents would have given him a chromosome that had both the spider gene and the head wobble gene. They both exist in the same chromosome. This concept of linked genes is the same reason that we see redheads often having blue eyes. Those genes are linked. They exist on the same chromosome, so it's very rare that they are separated. Notice I said rare. As with most things in biology, there is an exception to this. I'm just saying this because I know it'll be a rebuttal comment. If you've ever heard of crossing over, that is a phase in meiosis where the different chromosomes will mix on very minute levels. This is the only time where we could naturally potentially see the spider gene be disconnected from the wobble gene. Unfortunately, it's impossible to try to do this apart from breeding and breeding and breeding and breeding. The chances are extremely low, and it's even going to be hard to tell when it's happened because, as we stated, there's varying levels of severity. I should state that there is one way that I think it's possible that we could disconnect the spider pattern from the wobble. If we coded the entire ball python genome, we might have done that already, I'm not sure, but if we had the entire ball python genome coded, and then we were able to pinpoint the exact gene that caused the wobble, with today's genetic engineering, we could go in there and we could actually remove that gene in an embryo and replace it with the gene of a normal ball python. That's a real possibility. Unfortunately, there's two main roadblocks for that: funding and figuring out which gene it is that codes for that wobble. Those are the two main roadblocks, but if we found a way to overcome either of those, or both of them, I would be all for that. That is not at all something I'm against. I'm not out here bashing spiders just to bash spiders. If there's a way to actually separate the wobble from the pattern, then I would be all for that. So, you know, if somebody started funding a project for that, then I would be all over that one. Another big complaint I had is, well, why are you singling out the spider gene? There's other morphs that have head wobbles and issues and everything. Why are you just being mean to the spider gene? And yeah, I'm aware that there's other morphs that have issues, especially some of the higher level ones. When you have lots of different genes mixing together, it can cause some weird stuff. However, the spider gene is one I've had in-person experience with for a long time. Definitely felt comfortable tackling it. Not saying I won't tackle some of the other genes in the future, but I just felt a lot more comfortable starting with this one that I knew both firsthand and with anecdotal evidence. Also, you can go back and look at my other video. There was never any point when I said all other morphs are okay or I'm only singling out the spider gene. It was just the focus of a video. One of the arguments I dislike the most is, well, they were found in the wild that way. Okay, first off, we should know that something being found in the wild is not necessarily a metric for whether it's good for the animal or not. In captivity, lifespans are considerably longer than they are in the wild. That right there is evidence that just because it's wild doesn't make it the best interest of the animal. In the wild, ball pythons get eaten by all kinds of birds and beasts and critters and other snakes. In captivity, you shouldn't just, like make sure your ball python gets exposed to like birds of prey every day. Like, that's not how we operate. There's nothing else that we use that as a baseline for. However, I do understand the confusion here because I did compare the flopping over and the low speed. See, he's even doing it now. The very low speed of turning yourself back over, and I compared that to a wild snake. And I said that it would never be able to survive in the wild like this because it would be clawed open. So I can get the confusion there. What I was doing is I was trying to compare its behavior to that of a normal snake, because it's malfunctions of the behavior that can give us an insight into the psychological condition of the animal. So when we see issues with the behavior, that's usually a red flag. It's not really the fact that it wouldn't be able to survive in the wild that puts me off, it's the deviance from that normal behavior that puts me off. Does that make sense? Even if they were surviving in the wild, doesn't mean they were thriving in the wild. We don't know how long that population exists in the wild. We don't even know if it was a population. Maybe it was just one or two ball pythons that, got lucky and just didn't get eaten. It's possible they never could have passed on their genes because they were too floppy to find a good mate. It's possible they would have been eaten up like a day after. We don't know. So the fact they were found in the wild is not an indication of their ability to thrive. Another argument that is really closely related with that one is people were saying that by my arguments for the spider gene, we should also not be breeding albino animals or hypo animals or animals that would stand out or piebalgs that would stand out and die because of predator influence in the wild. Again, I don't really care about the color of the animal because she looks so much brighter and so much different colored than a normal ball python, but her behavior is the same. She doesn't have any hindrance when she goes and tries to eat a rat. She doesn't have any hindrance when she goes and drinks water. She doesn't have any hindrance when she's sleeping upside down, because she doesn't sleep upside down. Only this derp sleeps upside down. She doesn't have those roadblocks that animals like this experience. Therefore, her having a different color doesn't affect her life in captivity. This guy, yeah, he might eventually eat, yeah, he might do all those things, but his quality of life, I would say, is less than her quality of life. Not less enough to euthanize him, but not great enough that we should be continue breeding him. Okay, I think those are the main issues that I wanted to surmise in this video. Again, if you haven't seen my first video, you can check that one out with the iCard in the corner. And I know I bashed on Brian a little bit in this video, and sorry if that turned you off. I do encourage that you go and watch his video where he was kind of explaining more his side. I think it's very representative of a lot of breeders, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is pretty representative of a lot of breeders' stances on this issue. So go watch his video. Tell me what you guys think. You know, am I misrepresenting them? Am I misreading them wrong? Am I just not really understanding their point? Or do you just flat out disagree with the arguments I'm making? Let me know what you guys think. I'm always down to hear. Just like political issues, I think with issues like this, it's always important to look at both sides of the arguments and be bipartisan, if that can apply here, because it'll allow you to more inform your decision, your opinion on the issue, and to better inform arguments for or against either side of the issue. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoyed making it. I'm Amazing Ventures, and I'll see you in the next one.